I come to ask you to help to win this fight. If we win it, this hardest of all fights, then, to be sure, in the future it is going to be made easier for women all over the world to win their fight when their time comes.
Welcome to episode 3 of Not Small Men. When it comes to revenues, football isn't a level playing field, and that already applies to the women's game too. In revenue figures for the 2022-23 season, just Arsenal and Chelsea accounted for £20 million of the WSL total of £48 million. In the women's game, there are already big clubs and then everybody else. But obviously £48 million is a rounding error compared to the Premier League total revenue for the same season of £6 billion. They did though still manage to make a collective loss of £685 million. After its various worldwide bans and a period of getting back on its knees, women's football is trying to make up lost ground. In the absence of any significant revenues, some big-name men's clubs stepped in with at first 6-figure and then 7-figure subsidies for their women's team. And that's been a double-edged sword. It's been great for the handful of teams who've received that money, but it's also created an imbalance at a very early, formative stage of the women's game. Here's Sue Campbell, till recently Director of Women's Football at the English FA, and Lee Sanders from Durham FC, one of the pioneers at club level of this new phase of the game.
We all want the professional players to be given the salaries they deserve. We all want the women's game to thrive. Where challenges, we have a lot of money. So, you know, we're lucky in football in that we have got people who are subsidising, funding the women's game. And the ambition has got to be, how do we get to a place where any club can make it because it doesn't require that kind of subsidy? That is a really tough question. And if you were to ask netball or cricket, they're struggling with the same things for the women's game. We all want the top end of the game to thrive, for players to get the salaries they want, to make sure we've got the best interest of players' welfare, great physios, doctors, sports science, sports that. But the reality is that costs a lot of money. And the reality is, who's paying for that? And if you go out and you look, broadcasters don't want to give us a lot of money for our product. Commercially, Barclays have been awesome and remain awesome. But, you know, there's not many of them around. The reality is there isn't a lot of money that we can generate. And that's what NewCo is about. How do we generate more income to make the game more sustainable?
Because we are independent, we can't go into the red. If that makes sense, we've got to run the football club as a business, as a proper business. And that actually, when going back to when you first asked us, that's kind of what makes you proud, because we compete and we have to do all this as well and balance it all out. We can't run out of money in March, for example, and then go into the board of a club and say, oh, by the way, we've run out of money. Could we have some more? We've got to really run it, you know, start of this and end of the season as best we can. There's a well-run business, and I think that's important. I think the danger becomes now, if I'm looking at it for a men's football club with that hat on, if we have to keep coming back and asking for more and more and more every season, does the men's club at some point go, well, I'm sorry, we've done what we can, or we can't? You know, we can't all of a sudden have two senior budgets that are almost getting like similar levels, because we just don't have the commercial income for that or whatever. You know, and I'm not talking about it. I'm not talking about the big Premier League clubs or anything like that, because let's be honest, there is enough here. There's more than enough there. But once you get down to some of the clubs down to, you know, the bottom end of the Championship or League One or whatever, you know, decisions will have to be made.
In order to professionalise the game as they would see it, the FA introduced a licensing system to set minimum standards for participating clubs. Clearly a good thing. However, there are many voices in the game who have observed the rapidly escalating set of conditions within those licences and the consequent increases in mandated costs too. Helen Ward and Lee Sanders are general managers at Watford and Durham, respectively.
I think I heard numbers, I want to say around the overall sort of cost of running a championship club, I want to say was around £1 million. But that includes the grants and obviously you get a broadcast share as well, which is significantly higher if you're in WSL rather than the championship, but you do get that broadcast share thing, and then you top it up to around £1 million is what you can expect to be putting into a women's team, and that's only going to go up and up by the sounds of it.
The level of investment that we need to put in and bring in is significant. And again, for the right reasons, for the right reasons, staff should be paid that's a level that is allows them to have a life and to have families and pay mortgages and buy cars. And the same for the players. I think we go on a lot about the players, but we forget about the staff sometimes. That direct debit's about both. And when you started thinking about that and times it by 20 or 25 players, and then 12 to 20, 15 staff or whatever, you then go, okay, well, that's just the level of investment that's needed just for wages, for salary. And then you've got the infrastructure on top of that in terms of facilities, travel, hotels, pre-season games, referees' costs, security, all those things that go on top. And you're looking at a minimum spend now of probably in excess of 2 to 1.5 million, maybe, minimum.
Since the women's game has only really coalesced into an industry in the last 20 years, many describe it as still being in a start-up phase. That's an expression that covers a whole host of skills and vision required. I talked to Alexander von SCHIRMEISTER, UK Managing Director at Xero, one of women's football's biggest sponsors at all levels. Xero accounting software has over 4 million small business customers, so I thought he was a pretty good person to ask his perspective on what it means to act like a startup.
It's a really good question, Charles. I think if I think of startup, and again, I'm very influenced by the world of technology and technology startups, which is an environment I've been involved in over the last 20 years, right? One of the mantras of a technology startup is this notion of agility and this notion of nimbleness and the notion that, when you have a software, for example, you typically don't wait until your software is 100% perfect before you launch it. You launch an alpha and then a beta, and you launch versions of your software, and you just get it out there as quickly as you can, because you're using the initial usage of that as an immediate feedback loop to start working on it and perfecting the software, right? And so most of the big technology companies nowadays do continuous releases of software, and that's underpinned by this notion of agility. And so to me, a startup is exactly that, is you need to be very, very nimble, incredibly flexible, very reactive, and able to just continuously pivot and kind of reinvent yourself. And so this whole notion of we have always done it this way just doesn't work.
One thing that startups really need to get off the blocks is investment. At the moment, investment in the women's game is still patchy. Here's Sue Campbell and Helen Ward again.
Well, I think you have to recognise the women's sport, and I don't like using these words, but this is the reality, still a poor relation. And financially, it just doesn't attract the kind of investment that the men's game does, even when the men's game is not the very top of the men's game. It's a conundrum that we have to try and manage. It's tough.
What I see in the women's game is I don't want to take that risk. I want to know what I'm going to get back before I decide to commit to the support and the finances. Whereas they're much more willing to put their money at risk and their business and their name and their brand at risk in the men's game. And I don't understand that, because at some point, a long time ago, that was a huge risk to put money into football, I expect. But look at the rewards you now get from that. And it's kind of like, at some point, someone needs to be really bold and brave and say, I can see the future in women's football. I can see that eventually it will start making some money and it will start making some profit and it will become this multi-billion-pound business as we think it can be. But you have to have that foresight to do that. And I think it's probably the bravery that we're lacking at the moment for investors and partners and commercial deals. I think it's that final little bit of belief of, we think the game's going somewhere. Congratulations on your journey so far, but come back to us when you're there. But when are you ever there with anything? Everything's always going. There's never a final destination. Well, at some point, someone's going to have to say, yeah, it is the real thing, and I'm going to back it, and I'm going to go for it.
But women's teams are currently loss-making, is one of the things you still hear from time to time. Not from investors so much, but more usually from people in the men's game, which is kind of ironic. Let's get a couple of expert views from Jenny Haskell from Deloitte Sports Business Group and from the football business analyst Kieron O'Connor, also known as the Swiss Ramble.
We hear a lot of noise about the losses of women's football. And yes, there are losses that occur within the game, within each club. But I think that's kind of, almost an unfair narrative to talk solely about losses in women's sport when they're also apparent in men's sport. But also when we think about return, there is greater return than monetary return. But also when you think about different investor profiles and how they're entering women's football, is it from a commercial angle and you're looking at kind of that commercial revenue, visibility, visual appeal? Is it from an operations standpoint and you're really looking at on-pitch performance first, et cetera? So I think because these different profiles of investors are entering women's sport, there will be different aspects for returns. So some will need quicker return. If they might be private equity, institutional, et cetera, that might have a little bit longer return. But I think what's really important is that investors in women's sport right now have that time horizon to implement a certain strategy that they can use to optimize the business model of their investment. So like I mentioned, if you're going in from a perspective of, you're going to be operational on the commercial side of things and you're going to go from a brand appeal and build a brand around a women's team and continue that way, that might take a little bit longer to reach the performance aspects of it. And then you can, bring the revenues from the commercial side and bring it back together on pitch. So the time horizons will change based on the implementation strategy of different investors across the leagues.
One of the things that sort of slightly irritates me when people talk about the women's game is that they say, well, it's not making any money. And you sort of think, well, why on earth should the women's game be held to a higher standard than the men's game? I mean, the men's game is not exactly swimming in clubs that generate, huge profits. And in my piece, I noted that in 23, if you look at the top two divisions of the men's league, only one club made money at an operating level, and that was just 5 million. So you think, the WSL as a whole that year lost 19 million. Something like 31 of the men's clubs lost more than that individually. So you sort of think, okay, they're losing money, but in context, it's not an enormous sum.
In terms of investment, of course, the biggest current influx is from men's clubs putting money directly into their women's teams. Deloitte have estimated that as from the 2022-23 published club accounts, this group support, as it's called, was some £17 million, making up over a third of the total revenue of all WSL teams. Analysis by Swiss Ramble, as part of his comprehensive look each year at WSL finances, identified that at Arsenal alone, group support hit £6.4 million for the 2022-23 season. And there is, for the big clubs, an additional incentive to invest internally, as Kieron O'Connor explains.
The other point I would make, and I'm afraid it's a profitability and sustainability point, which is actually a plus for the women's game, is that what some people don't realise is that when a club is assessed to sort of meet those targets, or financial fair play as some call it, it's not the reported profit or loss that is assessed, it's an adjusted figure. So what the authorities allow is that what they deem to be healthy expenditure can be deducted. So anything into infrastructure or the academy or the community and women's football can be deducted. So it's not exactly a free lunch, but it does help when people are sort of looking at things like that to say, okay, the money that we put in, it's real money, it's real cash in the real world. But if you're looking at PSR, which is obviously a huge area of focus for many clubs now, the investment into the women's club doesn't count. So it's a good thing.
There are, though, downsides and distortions that come with this large S. Here's LEWES FC's Chief Operating Officer, Kelly Lindsay, and Julian Hadwiger from the WHU-OTTO BEISHEIM School of Management.
Everyone needs to understand in England, the money that is going into women's football is coming from the men's side. If I was a CEO on the men's side, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 8 million, somewhere between 1 and 8 million is what's coming typically from the men's side going to the women's. 1 to 8 million into your boys' academy. 1 to 8 million into a specific player that you think you're going to sell for 50 million. Like, it doesn't make sense if I'm the CEO of a men's team to not use that 1 to 8 million to make me 50 or 60 or 100 million, whatever that's going to be on the men's side. So you're asking people to literally, you're asking your men's team to literally be a charity to your women's. And that, I think, is wrong. And I think it doesn't create financial sustainability. And because of that, you are running women's football like on a thread of breaking it at every single moment. To just knock on men's doors and expect that you get millions of dollars just consistently. Relegation and promotion here, when a team gets relegated, the women are the most susceptible to being dropped. So it's not sustainable.
SGS Essen, which is in the first division, and they are fully independent women-only club. And they do great youth academy and so on. But I mean, they have to break even every season, obviously, because they do not have anyone subsidizing their operations. And they compete against integrated clubs where the men's team can subsidize the women's side, at least for a couple of years. So these women-only clubs, they have a significant financial disadvantage.
One upside, though, which comes with any investment, is that it becomes important for clubs to separate out and accurately attribute revenues to its women's team.
Even if there is, let's say, a commercial partner that wants to partner across the entirety of the brand, having the conversation on the attribution of value is important. Whether that means that, within the P&L or anything like that, but having that conversation is really the start of how the brand will activate differently. That isn't necessarily to say that every commercial partner should be different or should have, that you should only have women's only. I don't necessarily think that's the right move as well. But, as you start to think about commercial partners or as you start to think about investor profiles, it's how do you optimize the growth of the women's team as well. And I think having that conversation about attribution really forces you to think about the different ways in which you can show the value within the women's team as well as the men's team or as well as the academy, et cetera. So I think when you're starting to think about these brands on the women's side continuing to increase their profile, there will start to be that increased attribution of revenue.
This process of increasingly treating women's teams within clubs as separate businesses is a prerequisite for attracting further investment. You get the sense there are clubs out there where the subsidy from the overall club could be best characterised as reluctant capital. And yet, where investment has happened, on-pitch success ensues and new revenues are created. Here's Kieron again.
You can look outside England with Jean-Michel Aulas. He's been president of OL and has been a huge supporter of women's football. And he really sort of nailed it and said, look, it is in a startup phase. We are going to have to invest. We are going to lose money. But in the long term, we will make money because it's a different market, it's a different fan base. And so he's really put his weight behind the women's team. And the result is that they've been enormously successful, both domestically and indeed in the Champions League.
For an independent women's team, external investment is relatively straightforward. So now the big clubs are looking at how to restructure to get their own share of investors. Here's Helen Ward, General Manager at Watford Women.
I think Chelsea have been talking of sort of having their own investment and their own ownership within the club. And maybe that's the way forward if you get someone that doesn't own the club as a whole and then puts a portion of their money to back the women's team. Maybe it's somebody coming in to effectively own the women's team within the club umbrella, or have a significant stake in the women's team, whether that's a sponsor, whether that's a single owner or a group of owners. Because unless you do have the big billionaire owners that can afford to say, yeah, here you go, have $500,000, have £1 million, have £1 million, that doesn't doesn't touch the sides, it becomes a very difficult job. And I think that's what we found with the Readings of the world, where their owner's not able to provide that anymore, and they haven't been able to bring in any outside investment, so it becomes really tough.
In the Women's Championship League in England, both Durham and London City Lionesses took in significant investment before the current season, and both have now become serious promotion contenders. But what of day-to-day revenues? When it comes to matchday attendances, Arsenal are streets ahead. Last season saw a 71% increase in numbers. Chelsea too saw a 60% increase. Special mention to Bristol City, who in a relegation season knocked it out of the park on attendances. But of the 12 WSL teams, 6 saw very little growth or even slight declines, and 1 team saw gates drop by a third. To me, this just says that building a live audience takes time, and in the women's game, it takes constant innovation. Durham, in the Championship in England, have been brilliant at building attendances over time. Here's founder and general manager Lee Saunders.
Certainly locally, Mark Donnelly, teams our marketing, head of marketing, has done an unbelievable job in, bringing in spectators. So we, in year one, we had, hip our Mallory's dog into parents. And then, we go from 50 to 150 to 200. We thought, 8 years ago, 400 was like out of this world. And now we're getting on average 1,000. And we sell out our venue probably 5 times a season.
Again, it's about a startup mentality. Here's Alex from Xero again, and Julian at WHU-OTTO BEISHEIM School of Management.
There are startups that very quickly fall into legacy mode and kind of then hone in on a model and don't let go, and oftentimes pay dearly for that. But I think when I think of, and again, I'm just using somewhat some of what I've seen at Lewes FC when I've gone to the grounds to watch some of the games. Look, at every time I went to a game, there was something new being trialed or experimented, right? And whether those were the menu choices, and kind of by offering vegan food, for example, for a different target audience, or whether it was, having prosecco and not just lager on board, and having kind of family picnic tables. And there was this notion of continuous experimentation and continuous trial and error of how do we make sure that our game day experience adapts and adjusts to this new and different target audience, which is probably different from your box standard, we have always done it this way, men's football target audience that we all know and have known for many, many, many decades. Now, does that mean that a football club gets every single decision right? No, absolutely not, right? But it's in that experimentation that you're going to eventually hone in on what works, what doesn't work, what you can monetize, what you cannot monetize, and ultimately make sure that you have a successful franchise.
So we did have the first FFC Frankfurt. They were the most successful women's football club in Germany and basically all of Europe. And they did merge with Eintracht Frankfurt, which is the men's football team, so to say. And this got us thinking, because we're seeing more and more this integration of women's football into men's football. You have cited Arsenal. And what we wanted to see is, are more people coming to the stadium if the women's team play under a prestigious brand from men's football? So is there a brand spillover from the men's team to the women's team? This is what we checked. And summing it all up, we can say that just the brand spillover per se does not have a positive influence. So you cannot just put the badge on the jersey and then expect people to come. You need to proactively manage and activate this potential. And this is something which has been done tremendously by Arsenal. You cannot just expect people to come to a second or third tier stadium and watch you just because your brand is the same as a men's club. No, you need to actively manage and activate this brand potential.
And the new women's football fans like their merch too, if, that is, they can get it.
I think a really big topic of discussion right now is merchandising, and how merchandising is really underutilized on the women's game, but also we're way far along past the pink it and shrink it model when it comes to merchandise. So where it used to be, everything catered towards merchandise for men, for boys, or, similar styles, we're starting to see fashion play a really big role within women's sport and different cultural elements. How do you utilize that new trend to delineate a women's football club from a men's football club? Do you have different promoters, different sponsors, etc., that can then optimize their activation within the women's side? So I think merchandise is another way to get ahead in that aspect. But we'll start to see, again, that test and learn culture of what works for the women and what doesn't work for the men, but also where, and it's not a one size fits all. There are going to be commercial partners, and there are going to be certain elements that succeed from a full club level that utilize the entirety of the brand, and that's okay. Not everything has to be separated, but I do think as we start to see the involvement of the women's football teams in England, we're also starting to see more conversations be had about attribution of that revenue or attribution of an activation that is specific towards the women's side.
Hat tip here to Helen Hardy at Fowdies, who saw the opportunity in selling women's team kit and merch exclusively and now has a thriving business at Fowdies.com. NWSL clubs, of course, do this well. And under Mercury 13, FC Como Women in Italy now have a strategy where this is core too. They are also very focused on revenue streams that still feel very undertapped, like sponsorship. Kieron O'Connor has some useful analysis on this.
One difference in the women's game compared to the men's is that TV deals and broadcasting are not really what's driving the increasing revenue. It's the other two revenue streams. The biggest revenue stream by far is actually commercial. Even if you take the group support out, and that sort of emphasizes the fact that you've got a different market there, you've got different sponsors, which I don't think is sort of being fully explored. So you might end up with a sort of women's model, which actually is not dissimilar from an old-fashioned men's model, because the men's model has changed over the last sort of 30 years or so to be very much TV dominated. But when I was a teenager, it wasn't like that at all. There was hardly any football on TV, and if you wanted to watch a game, you went to, in my case, stand on the North Bank at Highbury, but you to a ground, and that might be, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, a sort of a direction for women's football, and say, look, let's look at it from that perspective, and the game goes back to its roots in every sense.
So why isn't sponsorship money flooding in? Because it isn't. It's arriving, but mostly only at the top of the game, with some notable exceptions, and it's still fairly patchy. Women's football is a very different environment, based on different values to the men's game, at least it is for now. So, do clubs understand what women's football offers that is of most value to a sponsor? I asked Alice at Xero why they sponsor women's football.
With some of our customers, as we talked about earlier, right, there are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of football clubs across the country, right? They're all shapes and sizes. And so the reality is our 1.1 million small businesses are more likely than not somewhere in some town, in some sort of council where there is a football club that they support or they believe in. And so being able to almost showcase to our small business community the fact that we are investing in the football in their communities and in women's football in their communities is another way for us to kind of close the loop and say, look, we are where you are and we believe in what you believe in. And certainly I've had a lot of feedback from many of our customers about the fact that they appreciate the fact that we're involved in community and kind of grassroots football.
I also asked Irene Merino, head of global gender balance at sports retailer Decathlon, what was missing in her opinion.
Yeah, everybody wants to talk about it. Everybody wants to do things. Sometimes it's linked with do nice things. And for me, it's more nice things. Nice thing to do is the right thing to do, which is for me completely different. And you need to have very specific KPIs. So what I miss from, for example, clubs is having concrete commitments about what it, in terms of club, how I want to really impact in my society. It could be in my community, in your neighborhood, in your city. I miss this kind of things in terms of clubs, in terms of people who is supporting football. We are just talking about performance. So how many goals, how many matches, how many minutes you play, but nothing around this kind of things.
Let's also hear what PhD researcher Fanny Almersson, Bettina BAER at Two Circles, and women's football strategist Paul Dreisbach think about sponsorship in the women's game.
I think there is a huge potential for women's football to actually attract new type of customers and partners that would like to partner up with women's football because of the values it stands for, because of its strong history in Sweden.
In men's football, what a brand mainly is looking for is eyeballs, reach. They want to have as many minutes as possible to show their logo. Whereas in women's football, because the reach also, it's also naturally that the reach is not as high. So you need to find different ways to create value. And then a sponsor can be much more engaged in and also carry their own company goals, be it retention of female talent or attraction of female talent, also employer branding. They have different targets they can carry into that partnership and activate around it. And there's much more room to activate, because also if you probably look at a, let's say, contract in men's football between a rights holders and a sponsors, and women's football, there's much more room to take space and have ideas and really kind of be a part and have a seat at the table in defining how we actually then activate the partnership. And the rights holders appreciate it as well, because they also, of course, appreciate that they invest and bring in expertise and activation. So the motivation is very different. I wouldn't rate if it's good or bad, but you can we see that a brand is now also looking for or coming from a different angle, usually, with their engagement in women's football.
Right now, let's just say, for example, like with the Women's Cup, we're working with soccer.com. So they're willing to give us a bunch of stuff for these youth clinics for these girls in the communities. Fantastic, right? And they get it. They understand it. They're not hung up on, okay, well, we're not getting enough exposure, so we're not going to help out there. That's not worth it for us, because not enough people see that we're doing it and why we're doing it. So they're leading with impact, because they know the stories generated from it will, in the end, help bring a better brand image, and because it's the right thing. So that tells me, okay, they know what's going on, they know it's the right thing, and it's going to help in the long run. Instead of saying, show us the metrics first, and then we'll decide if we want to have impact or not in the community, right?
Bettina and Paul's last point is a key one for clubs to take on board. Sponsors have an internal staff audience to communicate to, as well as new customers, and that is usually very much about values. But let's go back to Xero, one of the most active sponsors in women's football. What was their journey into women's football? Here's Alex von SCHIRMEISTER again.
In our case, it was almost like a double or triple whammy, in the sense that obviously, as a New Zealand born and headquartered company, the FIFA Women's World Cup being held in Australia, New Zealand was just a golden opportunity for us to get involved in what was going to be a very visible event in those countries. We also knew that other countries that we are active in, UK, US, were likely to do well and get quite a bit of viewership as part of the FIFA Women's World Cup. So I have to admit, yes, there was a opportunity of jumping on kind of that FIFA Women's World Cup being hosted in Australia, New Zealand. But it was more than that. It was the fact that it struck an emotional chord outside of just the marketing ROI. We support over 4 million small businesses in the world, and as you can imagine, our 4 million small businesses are as diverse as you would expect, kind of the universal representation of the population, right? The small businesses are owned and held by men and women, and by, go down any sort of diversity criteria you want. And it's just an incredibly, incredibly diverse small business force. And so us wanting to get involved in and investing in something which is representative of diversity was important to us. And certainly the Women's World Cup offered an opportunity to do that. Almost at the same time as we were getting involved with FIFA around the Women's World Cup, we had Maggie Murphy as a guest speaker at one of our internal kickoffs, where we do kind of annual kickoffs for our UK personnel. And Maggie Murphy, who was CEO of Lewes FC at the time, came to speak. There was just a massive aha in terms of, wow, holy cow, there's something way bigger here than just the FIFA World Cup, right? There's a real opportunity to grab women's football with both hands and make it a mission way outside and way beyond just a sponsorship opportunity. And to kind of get involved in it above and beyond the sports sponsorship decision, but more as is this a partnership that we want to sink our teeth into and invest in because it actually means something and because we actually can have impact on something that matters. And so that was kind of the genesis of how our involvement in women's football happened in the UK.
And perhaps we'll see a bigger market in the direct sponsorship of players who personify so much of what is different about the women's game.
So for me, rather than try to, hide this side of women in football, we need to give real visibility about what women want to achieve and to promote for the society. That is the most important thing for me. And sometimes it's not easy for clubs to understand this kind of challenge that we have today. They don't really know how to manage this topic, about how to manage the impact of women's players in the society beyond football.
Campaigning, having principles and talking about them, is very sponsorable for some brands. Roland Giscard d'Estaing thinks sponsors will really enjoy working with players too.
I'm often told by sponsors of men and female teams that when they go to men's team, the men aren't interested in the sponsors. They're just looking at their emails or check their mobile. Whereas women are very open, suggesting, why are you interested in us? What do you want to do with this sponsorship? How can we contribute to your brands or to the society? Women really care.
So are sponsors seeing enough purpose-based opportunities?
I was in Mexico since 5 years, and I went to open the Decathlon within the country. So it was an amazing experience. And our main priority is how we can really permit that people practice sport in Mexico at all levels. And it's something that is moving the company since the beginning, really linked with our DNA. What we need to also understand that the world is changing, and how we can bring the opportunity to make a sport is through products, is through experiences, is through our value of brand, how we are able to express sports differently than other competitors. So our role is critical to really put sport as a game changer in the society.
Because it is this authentic and very different aspect of the women's game that personally I'm still not seeing amplified enough by clubs or sponsors. How often do we read a press release about shared values, but when we see the sponsorship, it's another case of badging something and maybe running some competitions. I think the women's game has barely scratched the surface on sponsorship, but it has some ambitious targets. In England, the WPLL is talking about learning from the US experience of pooled rights. Here's Sue Campbell.
Why can't we have centralised rights for all of the commercial products that we sell in football clubs for the women? Why can't we put it in the middle? Because the NFL model, the National Football League model in America, shows we have collective rights, you generate a heck of a lot more money. All right? Why can't we do that? Why can't we have one shirt supplier? Do you imagine how much money you'd get for that compared to each club negotiating a shirt supplier? But you're changing their model. You're changing something they've been doing for years and years and years into a model that says, no, this can generate more.
How well could that work? And how would the central revenues be shared out? How far down the leagues? Of course, in some respects, the women's game is doing better on sponsorship revenues than the figures suggest. In Europe, the great majority of women's teams operate out of a bigger men's club, and deciding who gets how much of the revenue between the club men's and women's team can be contentious, but it matters. Fanny Almersson's work at Hammarby in Sweden is indicative of the conversations going on at many so-called double clubs.
What they did was that they really tried to prove through using numbers from media exposure of how much the women's team is reported on in newspapers and articles to change this number, because they said that it's also affecting the view on women's football internally. If we would change that percentage and have an 80-20 split on the commercial revenues where the women's team would get 20%, they would break even.
I want to move my attention now to TV and online coverage of matches. In the men's game, this is the huge revenue driver and also increases sponsorship deal values by giving brands on-screen presence. So, is it as simple as chasing the same golden goose for the women's game? One key question is reach versus revenue. If you wanted to maximise revenue in the short term, you'd grab the biggest deals, which are those offered by paywall channels such as Sky. If, on the other hand, your strategy was to maximise reach, how many new people get to see a game, then you would favour free-to-air broadcast television. So where is the balance?
Generally, I would agree that with less mature markets that it's quite important that you have reach, but then you probably at some point reach a certain point in time, and that might take, is very different from market to market. But for the WSL, I think it's probably a good moment to think about that as well, not only to prioritize reach, but to make sure that now the products and the commercial models are created to make the game financially sustainable. As to Circles, we also consult rights holders in that question, reach versus paid. But also here, it's quite interesting that in women's football, we see different models and innovative models evolving and more flexible models, and that better suits the product. What I mean by that is often you have a league where there's some very big games that are of great interest, but then you also, the curve flattens quite quickly, and you might also have some smaller clubs. Spain is a good example as well, with Barcelona, Real Madrid, Atletico Madrid, and then it flattens out quite quickly in terms of who wants to watch those games. So if the league can now find the perfect way to leverage those big games and draw in audiences in a paid setting, but then also make sure that there's enough visibility and reach to also attract new audience or the wider audience, or maybe you would have then all the games that might only attract the very core fans of those clubs on a different platform, so you can still make sure all the games are available, but you segment in terms of even down to the games in terms of potential audience and be more, let's say, creative in slicing and dicing those packages and distributing them to the right audience with the right, let's say, interest level.
To give an idea of the extended reach of a WSL match on the free-to-air BBC versus Sky, the Chelsea-Liverpool match in November 2023 drew an average of almost 800,000 viewers. Compare this to another big match, the Manchester Derby, but this time on Sky, later that season. It drew an audience 40% lower. This difference is the normal pattern, underlining how many more people watch free-to-air. But the other aspect to note is that all broadcasters favour the bigger clubs for their coverage.
TV perspective, it will also increase the interest of women's football overall. So it's a trade-off there, because on the one hand, you want to make sure that it's a really good game and it's a crowded game that is shown on TV because it brings interest from new fans and supporters. But on the other hand, there are a few teams that are exposed to the media and to fans, supporters, and the bigger audience more.
And this leads, of course, to bigger clubs expecting more of the money, which means they can afford better squads and cement their hegemony. And on it goes. And so long as the big Premier League clubs receive the lion's share of the available revenues, then this is a gap that will only get wider, but also at some point could never be bridged. Or could it? The next TV deal is done for the WSL and Championship. The total amount being paid by Sky and BBC is reported as around £13 million per season over 5 seasons. On the face of it, this is an impressive increase in the previous £8 million per season. However, the new deal gives Sky 78 exclusive matches and another 40 non-exclusive, whereas the previous 3-year contract allotted them only 35 exclusive games plus another 9 non-exclusive. So the price being paid per match is actually lower. As an FYI, the number of games on the BBC, i.e. broadcast free-to-air, falls now from 22 to 21. Just before the new TV deal was announced, I spoke to football finance expert KIERON O'Connor about the pros and cons of free-to-air deals versus pay TV, and also how it worked with the Men's Premier League when it started back in 1992.
I would think if they had a similar structure, they could push to get 15, maybe 20 million. I think 20 million would be a bit toppy. So let's say it's 15, so nearly twice as much. I think if they just did it free to air, I think they'd struggle to get more than the current 8 million. Now that's real finger in the air estimate, but I think that's the sort of comparison that we're talking about. And you might say, well, okay, it's less money in the short term, but actually it's not a bad investment in terms of boosting the game's longer-term prospects. Because there's no doubt that free-to-air gets a bigger audience. So you might say, well, at the beginning, we'll sort of restrict the number of games that are on pay TV, maybe to a limited selection or even none at all. And again, if you look at what happened with pay TV on the men's game, at the beginning, there were relatively few games shown live. I mean, now virtually everything is. Okay, it's a significantly bigger sum of money. But if you sort of looked at that graph, it was very sort of low, flat, and then it sort of took off. So you might sort of take that longer term view.
It appears then that the gambit being played here with the new deal is about maximising short-term revenue, which can then be used to boost the women's game in England. And the advent of the new WSL YouTube channel does also open up viewing to those who don't have Sky TV, with the YouTube-only games also being available to a global audience. The TV deal ties in Championship clubs too, despite the fact they are rarely, if ever, shown on Sky or BBC. I can't help wondering if the game may be better served by freeing up teams outside the WSL to experiment with other forms of match coverage, either independently or working with other distribution platforms. I asked Bettina BAER if this was feasible.
Yes, I can definitely imagine that scenario, and I also think that it makes a lot of sense in a lot of leagues. But it's exactly that, to really be smart around, or to really be aware of what the product is now, and not just say, well, actually in men's football it looks like that, so how can we apply that to women's football as well? But to really understand the audiences and the different different types of games and clubs that exist. Another aspect that plays into that, which I think is quite interesting when you think about media production and distribution, is that currently, yes, Arsenal now is playing their big games in the, not only the big games, but all games in the Emirates, their home games, which is fantastic. And also the media product will look great because you have a stadium, you have a big crowd, that also increases the quality of the media product. But for many clubs, and not only in the WSL, but especially in smaller leagues, also at the Frauen-Bundesliga, some stadiums are still quite small and not even suited to hold a high quality media production with 8 cameras. So also already there, you can save money by being smart about which venues do I cover, when do I produce with 8 cameras, but when is it also perfectly fine if I use it not a low cost but a more efficient cost production. So that's it, and that's exactly that thinking that needs to go into it to make it suitable for the product. So and that goes on to how do you sell it, how do you price it, package it, when you distribute to clients. So yes, I think that I can see that happen. And I think it also makes a lot of sense in terms of cost efficiency and just different interest levels about different games to match that in the market.
It feels like now is the time to encourage innovation, to try stuff out. Here's Bettina again.
What we can already see now is happening is that new platforms start to evolve as well. So it's not only taking time away through linear TV or free to air, but there's also new products being added to increase visibility. As an example, we work with a lot of women's football leagues or in the biggest football markets, but also second tier markets like Switzerland and Denmark. And they're also now thinking about that. Well, how can we distribute our product to fit purpose or to really make it suitable for that women's football product? So based on that development, they are also setting up new OTT platforms, for example, or finding new channels to make the product accessible right now. So it doesn't have to compete necessarily with men's football right now.
And this point about having most of your matches on channels and platforms already dominated by men's football is a key one. In the UK, Sky now shows every season some 215 Premier League games, and wait for it, another 1,059 Football League matches too. So that's 1,274 men's matches across its football channels. Statistics show that when the start time for a men's match overlaps a women's game, the women's audience drops. The challenge is for women's games therefore to get decent broadcast slots, but also for games to get advertised against all the existing promotion of men's matches. And will the £30 million per season boost the whole of the women's game, or as in the men's game, disproportionately benefit the existing big clubs? I don't think the signs are good. Currently, once deductions have been made for administration by the league centrally, a whacking 75% of the rest goes to the WSL, leaving 25% for the Championship and little or nothing for the National League below that. That's just market forces, they say. No, that's a built-in oligopoly, I say. Based on this kind of distribution model, an outsider observer would reasonably surmise that the aim of women's football is to duplicate the structural flaws of the men's game by strengthening the coffers of the clubs that need it the least, but guaranteeing at the same time a chasm in the women's football pyramid. One redistributive idea that is rapidly gaining traction in England is to offer equal prize money in the Women's FA Cup and the men's. It would of course be a statement of equity, of valuing the game properly, but on a very practical point, it would also create a significant additional revenue stream for women's teams at all levels. Here's Lee Sanders from Championship side Durham again, followed by Sue Campbell.
The biggest driver for change for me in the women's game is the FA Cup. You can't, there's all the competition where a team from tier 6 can, historically girls and women would have been paying subs, training once a week in the dark at 10 o'clock at night, a couple of early rounds in the FA Cup. That's transformative. You get a little bit further up the pyramid, and you get to a tier 4 club who maybe wins a couple of rounds at the level they're at. And all of a sudden they've gone from maybe having a revenue of maybe £5,000 a year that's predominantly made up of subs and maybe a front of shirt sponsor and a couple of quid through the gate to maybe actually winning £20,000-30,000 in prize money. And that can be transformative in so many ways.
When I first came in, the money going into the FA Cup was not great. We then got a £3 million uplift, and we put that very much at the bottom. We didn't try and put that at the top. We didn't move the top very much at all. I then got another 3 million last year. That thanks to the support of the chief exec, who's very committed to getting to equity. We've got a little journey to go on there, but we're getting there. So now we're 6 million better off than we were 2 years ago, and we have put a bit more at the top at this time because but if you listen to the feedback we're getting, a lot of those smaller clubs have made enough money to look after themselves for a couple of years, out of the FA Cup money for the women's game. So we'll keep looking at that, and developmentally, that's the only money these people get. So it's important that we make sure it's distributed down the pathway. I think we're making some progress there. The problem in terms of broadcast distribution is the reality is the clubs would tell us, other than only a few of them, that it's costing them a lot of money to run the women's game and they need support, and we want to improve standards.
As a famous brand once said, just do it. Equal FA Cup prize money will happen, so I'd say to the FA it would look so much better to take a lead on this rather than wait for the current head of steam to build still further and make it appear you were dragged kicking and screaming to the right outcome. The FA in England have done such a good job in women's football over the last decade or so in particular, it would be a shame and kind of bizarre to be beaten to equal cup prize money by the FIFA World Cup. They announced a while back the intent to equalise prize money from 2027. And perhaps we need some regulatory oversight in the women's game to help create a fairer distribution of revenues overall. Indeed, Kieron O'Connor believes that the Football Governance Bill recently in Parliament would be better for including women's football.
What happens with the sort of government-led review, and particularly the part about redistribution of funds within the game, I mean, that's focused quite a lot on the share between the Premier League and the Football League. And increase in the amounts of the Football League. So again, if I were in Newco, on my sort of massive to-do list would be to knock on the door of the new government and say that when you're looking at the redistribution of funds, please don't overlook the women's game and spell out all of the advantages that we've discussed in detail about how this is unquestionably a good thing, and try and get a much bigger slice of the pie there. Because if you can do that, then that might influence your discussion about broadcast and say, okay, we go free to air, we get a smaller amount, but it's effectively being subsidised by the government. And that's a conversation that is well worth having. And for all I know, they're almost certainly having it anyway.
One revenue cost area I haven't looked at in any detail here is player transfers. In men's football, they make up a significant part of many clubs' turnover and one of the key ways in which investors look to build profit in a club. Not so much yet in women's football, but we have recently seen the first $1 million transfer, with defender Naomi Girma moving from San Diego Wave to Chelsea. This is good news for the elite clubs who can increasingly look forward to a future where player trading becomes a new revenue source. But I think it's mixed news for the women's game in general. Yes, some clubs in the Championship and possibly the National Leagues may be able to sell players to WSL clubs at higher prices and boost their revenues, but at the same time, it accentuates and accelerates the gap that is already almost unbridgeable for teams outside the WSL and without the ability to call on quick cash injections from Premier League parent clubs. The benefit of a new world of mega transfers seems likely to disproportionately benefit the existing elite teams. Unless perhaps, and I think I know who's going to hate this idea, there was some kind of levy on transfers over, say, £100,000, with the proceeds going into player development further down the football pyramid. My interviewees have been in solid agreement that the women's game has the opportunity, in fact, duty to itself, to think differently and act differently when it comes to building commercial models for success. Really, how much is there to copy anyway from a men's version which is a wasteland of loss-making clubs with out-of-control costs and increasingly stale revenue streams?
There has to be new innovations within the women's game. And so we're, again, going back to that test and learn culture. That might be a ticketing strategy that's different. That might be match day performances that are different, that attract a new set of fans. You can optimize the brand while also being specific to the women's team and the women's brands, but also how brands interact with the women's team and the men's team can and probably should be completely different.
Thanks for listening. In the next episode, we go on a world tour to try and see the women's game in a larger context. I found my conversations not only eye-opening, but also humbling and inspiring. I hope you will too. Till next time.
Not Small Men is a Good Intent Media production.